For those of you who have done psychedelics, acid, LSD, shrooms, DMT, salvia, etc., what was your trip like? I love hearing these stories. Horizontal ellipsis. My shroom trip was one of the best experiences of my life. It started with a peanut butter sandwich with shrooms and ended with me thinking I was becoming one with the water in my buddy's pool by seeing myself dissolving into the water. I was the only one tripping with a large group of friends. I was forbidden from being given any beers because I wanted to pour them all over my head because the carbonation felt like fireworks were popping all over my body in a good way. It took them at least 5 beers to realize I was doing this. I sat in front of a shitty painting of Greek columns and a pool watching the water sloshing and listening to the sounds of an ancient pool party. One of my highlights was leaning against my buddy's screen door and actually believing I had superpowers because I could see myself melting through the screen. I also ate paper and felt like it tasted like the best thing in the world. One of my highlights was leaning against my buddy's screen door and actually believing I had superpowers because I could see myself melting through the screen. I took MDMA, which isn't considered by some a psychedelic, cried for the first 10 minutes it set in, puked, then felt amazing for the rest of the night. Wasn't a big fan of shrooms. I kind of felt panicky and paranoid the whole time, couldn't relax. DMT is like 15 minutes of the worst trip you'll ever experience. It feels like hours and you can't move at it. I've done salvia a few times and only tripped once. I was laying on my friend's bed with my head under her window and the breeze was blowing the curtain over my face. I was pretty much convinced it was a lady in a colonial dress flopping it on and off my face. I laughed for 15 minutes straight. DMT, I had an open eye visual of traveling through, more like flashing, as if it were 2 frames per second. Neon lit gridded corridors, sort of Tron-esque, which were pulsating and changing colors until I came to a huge room. In the center was a pedestal, which I traveled toward and found a glowing gold Triforce, which I'm sure you Redditors will appreciate. And upon picking it up I was quickly thrown down more corridors that branched in almost fractal patterns. All the while they pulsated and changed shape and color. Eventually I was thrown into a bright light and ended up in a huge cavern that seemed 30 stories tall, and was colored by the EM spectrum. Roigbib top to bottom coming from the cavern were Gallagher ships with rainbow trails as the trip faded. Needless to say, mind fucking blown. PTL, DR, DMT trip, grabbed Triforce, thrown down Tron tunnels into Rainbow Gallagher cavern. First time I ever tripped mushrooms. I ate them outside and smoked a few blunts after. I began thinking about my life and began having realization upon realization accompanied by waves of strong emotions. I thought about how I still have so much to offer to the world, how young I was, what I could do better, how much of a dick I was to my parents, etc. I felt like I was on another planet. The skies were cloudless and the moon was still visible. I was convinced I was on Mars or something. I drank a shitload of mushroom tea in Thailand and got caught in a monsoon. It was so incredibly beautiful. I just ended up walking for miles through the jungle with a friend, utterly soaked. Magical. Another time I took acid to festival, got in the pit for basement jacks, and hooked up with a girl who was on too much coke. She gave me a rock of MDMA for my trouble afterward. Awesome. TLDR, drugs are great. Even the interesting guy though. He brought his friend over with him and he was the interesting guy. So the guy who was my friend's friend brings this guy over to my friend's place with him. And they said let's smoke a bowl. So my friend who I had been hanging out with and I pulled out some weed so we could match them and they just told us to put it back in our pockets and to come outside. So we go outside and the guy who was my friend's friend's friend, I'll call him Tom from now on, had a pound of weed in the trunk of the car. Cool. Tom's dad had died a short amount of time prior and had been receiving $10,000 a week from his dad's life insurance policy. This guy was not responsible with his money at all. He bought drugs all the time in bulk quantities. He didn't even sell drugs. We just sat and snorted smoked them like that's what we were made to do. Well, Tom became a familiar face. We did a lot of drugs at his expense all the time. We did crazy shit non-stop for a long time. One weekend he got a pound of weed and 50 ecstasy pills and said we were going to Atlantic City for the weekend to get wild. Cool. So we get to Atlantic City and get a couple of hotel rooms at this rather nice hotel. And upon entering the rooms, Tom wasn't satisfied with how big they were, so we trashed them and left. I mean it when I say we trashed those rooms. He paid bills for damages to places we rented all the time because he seriously did not give a single fuck because he had so much money. So he rented a beach house on the spot after the hotel disappointment, and we pretty much went wild at that house the whole weekend. On the last night we were there, it was about 5 or 6 AM and things had died down. At this point it was just Tom, 3 other friends of mine, a hooker Tom had bought earlier in the night, and I just sitting in the living room. Tom told the hooker that he wanted to fuck her again, so they went into one of the bedrooms and fucked. After a bit of time the hooker comes back out of the room and Tom didn't. He had fallen asleep after fucking her. Typical. It's worth noting that Tom had gotten this same hooker multiple times on previous trips to Atlantic City and she was kind of a friend. Ha, yay. Strange shit happens when you're throwing huge parties in Atlantic City all the time. I could tell so many stories of shit that went down when we were hanging out with Tom. Anyway, she sits back down and we're all just hanging out, smoking weed and rolling our asses off. At some point the hooker began to look at the time on her phone somewhat frequently as if she was anxious. She mentioned that she had to be somewhere soon, and nobody still in the house had a car with them except for me, and I was in no condition to drive. I can't remember where she had to go. I think it may have been a drug test at the hospital or something. Fuck if I know. Honestly, that was a while ago and I was really fucked up at the time. It was something important though, so this hooker is kind of starting to bug out about where she needs to go. So she goes into the bedroom to try and wake Tom up so he would give her a ride. No luck. She comes back into the living room and chills for maybe another hour and then goes to try to wake Tom up again. This time she comes out of the room and said she would be back in a bit. Tom told her to take his car, so she leaves. As I said, this hooker was kind of a familiar face at this point and Tom wasn't exactly the kind of person who wouldn't have told her to take his car, so nothing seemed strange. At some point I fell asleep, as did everyone else. We were woken up when Tom woke up and went outside for a moment, noticed his car missing, and then busted into the house asking where the hooker was and where his car was. We told him that we were under the impression that he had told her to take it to where she had to go, to which he replied that no, he had never told the hooker she could use his car. I guess the hooker had gone into his room and dug around in his pockets and taken the keys. She stole the car. It's worth noting that the house was in the condition that a house is left in after a weekend of nothing but straight partying. The pound of weed that Tom had bought, upon us entering the home, had literally been put on the coffee table. Not in a bag, not even on a pan or something, just on the coffee table. That was how we did shit. The drugs were just out, the place was trashed, and drugs were everywhere. We still had a pretty decent pile of weed on the table and there was a cereal bowl with the remains of the 50 ecstasy pills in it right next to it. Weed was also everywhere on the carpet in the living room because during our first day there someone commented on the weed on the table and Tom replied by saying he didn't care about just having it out because it was just drugs. To prove this he took a few handfuls and threw them at the guy who said something. I'm not kidding when I say there was weed all over that room. There were blunt guts on the floor. It was just a fucking mess, man. It looked like the most classy crack house ever. But Tom was freaking out. His car had been stolen. Before I was even fully awake from his initial burst back into the house he was holding his phone saying he was calling the cops. Well, shit, I was out if that was the case. I hopped the fuck up and put on my shoes and told my friends that if they didn't want to be there when the cops showed up that they had to leave right then because I was leaving right that fucking instant. So my friends made the smart choice and we all left Tom in that house to deal with the cops on his own. We didn't hear from him for maybe half a week until he randomly showed back up in town. with his car. After having been arrested, the cops found his car on the side of the highway somewhere, and by some sort of miracle Tom hadn't been charged with any of the drug stuff but had been arrested due to a traffic warrant or something. He paid off his fine for the ticket when he got his $10,000 that week and then was released. I assume he may have paid the cops a bit extra for the drug charges as well, but he said he didn't do that. Yay. There's a nice long crazy story for you. Anyone who deliberately ruins a room because it wasn't big enough really pisses me off. I don't know. He has so much money and he chooses to waste it. With that much money I'm sure both you and I could think of a million better things to do. Thanks again for telling the... I can't remember how much we took, but we had bought a baggie worth, and we all just took pinches out and swallowed. Passed the baggie around until it was all done. We sat around watching some VHS until suddenly, things were weird, things were different. It took me by surprise because I expected my vision to go odd, but that my thought process would remain about the same. Instead, both were a bit odd. In fact, it was more like my brain was odd, and my vision was fine. For example, I was looking at the carpet and I could see patterns in it. Woman dancing, flowers moving, bees buzzing. Once I tried to concentrate on it though, focusing my eyes and attention on it, it would disappear. Which was okay. It wasn't hard to loosen my attention and see the patterns again. I really think taking mushrooms had a good effect on me. I felt like I had a few insights into myself and my behavior while exploring the house and interacting with my friends. I felt liberated, like I could finally say goodbye to childhood and the insecurities that I had felt, and face life as an adult. I recall thinking of many different art projects or artistic endeavors. I got a lot of different art ideas that I'm still trying to realize 10 plus years later. Overall, I think it was a great experience. I think some of the things that made it great were controlled guest list. We girls knew it was just us and no one else. No boyfriends, no parents, no unexpected visitors, just us girls. Controlled environment. We knew the house. We had wandered around it once or twice before and knew the layout. It was a familiar place. Took mushrooms during the day. Fewer opportunities for things to get creepy or scary. No other drugs. No booze. No pot. I think we had some cigarettes. We were all decent friends and we'd all been high. Pot. With each other on at least one other occasion. So we didn't have any tensions or issues that were going to crop up suddenly. That's all I can think of right now. Excited to read everyone else's stories. Shit. Man, sounds like some dope ass LSD. Point where I started losing my hair. I went away with friends, a bunch of them, to a holiday house one of their parents owned, near a forest, and about 15 of us took mushrooms then went on a hike. Trying to control 15 people on mushrooms is almost impossible, and quite honestly, what I used to enjoy the most while on mushrooms was to just explore and get lost in the things around me. But we had to be quite strict, for want of better words, in terms of handling people and making sure we got back before it was dark and so on. On the way back, I was walking at the end of the line. We passed what was, for me, the most beautiful view of a river with a cliff behind it. I decided, fuck it, everyone else can carry on. I want to be here right now. I still have the notebook where I wrote down the words: if you smoke, drink, go to college, don't go to college, complete your assignments or not. It's all entirely up to you. You choose this. Every day, you forget how completely in control you are, and it scares you. Several minutes later, everyone turned around when they realized I wasn't with them, came back, and sat down next to the river with me. I'm an atheist, but it was an almost spiritual experience for me. Since that day, 10 years ago now, I know that I'm at this job, I drive this car, I live in this house, I do the things I do because I want to. And while it doesn't make any of those things better, in a way, the constant thought at the back of my mind that no one's got a gun to my head, I am doing the things that I ultimately want to do, brings me a constant sense of tremendous peace.